Welcome all to this session on business measures for business. We'll be going to discuss a really important topic that you might hear a lot during the Congress in the context of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. The aspect of biodiversity measures has been popping up, and there is increasingly more pressure and demand that business start adopting measures to measure their impact and their progress in terms of biodiversity. My name is Rodrigo Cassola. I'm a Senior Program Officer with UNEP WCMC, working as part of our Nature Economy team. And I'll be introducing the session and then passing over to Martin Locke from the Capitals Coalition, who will be moderating the panel. The idea is to discuss measures for business in the context of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So covering the current and future policy context. The agenda today, we will start by introducing the meeting objectives. We will see a video from Eva Zeble, the Executive Director from Business for Nature, and then pass over to Martin for a panel discussion with high-level panelists. Our objectives today are to discuss the drivers for business measurement and disclosure, to strengthen global biodiversity policy, understand the role of biodiversity measures in enabling the private sector contributions to a nature-positive world in 2050, discuss challenges and barriers that business have in implementing measures, and increasing awareness of private sector engagement with the biodiversity-relevant policies. This session is being live-streamed, so I also welcome our participants online. The participants that are online will be able to ask questions using the chat box. We will be moderating those during the chat sessions, the question and answer sessions. There will also be time for physical people that are here in person to be asking questions. You have there some context. If you have any questions following this session, you can email any of us there. Starting then with a video from Eva Zeble from the Business for Nature.
I'm delighted to join you today. Thank you so much. I hope, like me, you've seen the growing momentum, interest, and scrutiny around business, measurement, evaluation, and disclosure of their impacts and dependencies, not only on their environmental issues, but on social and governance too. And the fact that there is this growing momentum and interest and scrutiny is really a good thing, because it means businesses know that they need to manage their risks and opportunities. And as a result, they know that they need the right information. In fact, to transition to a nature-positive economy, all businesses and financial institutions will need to measure, value, and disclose their impacts and dependencies on nature. And you might ask, why? Well, they need to know if they're operating within planetary boundaries. They need to know if their operations and investments impact nature negatively or positively, and also how exposed they are to nature-related financial risks. So how do we do this? How do we get this information? And a number of tools already exist, which is great. Natural Capital Protocol, the Encore tool, just to name a few. But more generally, I think we need three things to seriously start to integrate nature-related performance into all decision-making and disclosure. Number one, we need meaningful and credible ESG data alongside traditional financial reporting to make those better informed integrated decisions. This data, of course, needs to be grounded in science, for example, by using the upcoming science-based targets for nature methodologies. Corporate performance indicators must go beyond only the financial performance and embed the true value of natural, social, and human capital to reveal the full state of health of the planet, people, and profits. Number two, investors should stop investing in activities that have a negative impact on biodiversity and should call for companies in their own portfolios to issue reports aligned with the Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosures as soon as it's ready. And number 3 is we need actually to consider the full accountability system for the global commons, meaning how across all actors in society, we ensure our shared accountability for the health of our planet, and that is reflected in performance, whether it's the performance as a citizen, a consumer, a company, an investor, or a government, for example. Now, getting the measurement right is critical, but really to scale and speed up action, we need governments to implement ambitious nature-positive policies. So the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework of the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is due to be agreed at this upcoming COP15 in Kunming in China, this framework has the potential to scale and speed up action for nature and unlock trillions of dollars in economic opportunities. And there are a few ways that companies can engage in the CBD COP15. First of all, you can join as companies, more than 900 other companies that have signed up to the Nature is Everyone's Business call to action, which urges governments now to adopt policies to reverse nature loss in this decade. And you can also support the Leaders' Pledge for Nature, which has been signed by nearly 90 countries committing to reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. As a company, you can also encourage your own governments to adopt policies that create a stable operating environment and a level playing field for businesses. One quite straightforward way to do this would be to support and then share Business for Nature's specific suggestions to improve draft 1 of the framework. And we've developed these by engaging hundreds of companies and organizations, so you can feel the confidence that you can build on and share these specific suggestions. They include, we've got to set a global mission for nature in the framework. We must value and embed nature into all decision-making and eliminate or redirect all harmful subsidies. And then finally, as companies, you can show up and speak up at the key events like COP15 and on social media. You can also contribute to the UN Climate COP26 in Glasgow, which is also a critical opportunity for nature, and it's an opportunity to drive that integrated climate and nature policy to address the twin crises. As our partners in We Mean Business are pushing for, we need to go all in for 2030. We need to go all in for the most important race of our generation, the race to a nature-positive, net zero, and equitable world. Thank you very much.
Yes, this was a nice introduction to the next part of our session. I will pass over to Martin Locke from the Capitals Coalition, who will be moderating the panel in the next part.
Thank you very much, Rodrigo. And a warm welcome to all of you who came to Marseille and to our audience online. If the audience online will allow me, I want to get a grasp on who we have in the room, because we will be talking about business and nature. So who's from business and who's from nature, who's from finance, who's from government, or who's from other organizations. So just who works in a company with a business, a couple of hands. In finance, financial sector, only one, maybe 1.5. A conservation organization, other civil society organizations, good crowd too, good that you're here, thank you. Governments, not leaving them out. Only you, oh, that will be good, but you're on the panel, so that's a good spot to speak as a government. Warm welcome. My name is Martin Locke. I'm the Executive Director of the Capitals Coalition. And for those of you who don't know the Capitals Coalition, we are an international coalition bringing together over 400 organizations worldwide, from business, from finance, from governments, from civil society, from accountancy standard setters, from the academic world. So a broad coalition that has come together to work on better decision making. So our aim is to embed the value of nature and people into all of decision making by business, by governments and finance. And we do this together with all these partners. So that's just a little heads up on who we are, what the Capitals Coalition does. Already Eva mentioned the Natural Capital Protocol. This was our first product that we launched in 2016, which interestingly enough was more or less at the same time when IUCN Congress met in Hawaii. It was, I think, 2 months before that. And this was for the first time that there was a protocol, an international recognized framework that helps the business community to understand how they can start understanding their impacts and dependencies on nature. So the protocol is a 9-step approach, very practical, but at the same time 140 pages. Just to make sure that you understand that it's thorough and it's a big piece of work that was created, among others by Eva. She was one of the authors at the time. And after that we moved on. We also published a social and human capital protocol in 2018 and loads of additional guidances, including the biodiversity guidance that we launched this year that provide very specific guidance to businesses and financial institutions, how they can understand their interaction with biodiversity, and also how they can start measuring and valuing their impacts and dependencies. And that is also the key thing what we are going to discuss here today with a panel that I will introduce later. 3 speakers, one from business, one from finance, one from government. But before we go to the panel, I would like to invite Elise Bell to present an overview of how UNEP WCMC is working on measurement and methodologies that business and finance can use to understand their impacts and dependencies, but also to start disclosing it and sharing that knowledge with their stakeholders.
Okay, thank you, Martin. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah? So yes, my name is Elise Bell, and I'm delivering this presentation actually on behalf of colleagues in the Business and Biodiversity program in Cambridge. So I'll be relying on my notes a little bit. I work in fact for WCMC Europe myself, which is a new entity that was created by WCMC recently to expand our portfolio of projects in Europe. Part of my duty is to oversee some projects, mainly EU-funded projects, and one of these projects is the ALIGN project, which is aimed at supporting businesses in developing standardized natural capital accounting practices, especially for biodiversity. Okay. In early 2020, the Aligning Biodiversity Measures for Business Collaboration, led by UNEP WCMC, launched a review paper on the current status of biodiversity measurement and disclosure practices from an international perspective. The review paper was based on a preliminary desktop review and also a discussion with stakeholders and government representatives, and that included governments from China, the Netherlands, the UK, South Africa, and Brazil. The paper reviews the drivers and current practice around business measurement, reporting, and disclosure on biodiversity, and it investigates the role of these approaches in future business disclosure for informing global policy targets. It is intended to also brief policymakers on the current status of business biodiversity measurement and reporting. And it also provides recommendations for key actions that are required to create a step change in business reporting, as the engagement of the private sector will be essential to the successful implementation of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. To better integrate the perspective of businesses within the post-2020 biodiversity framework, the review paper was synthesized into a formal information document which was submitted to the CBD prior to the subsidiary body of implementation meeting, which took place earlier this year. The document has also been shared with CBD parties prior to the start of the negotiations. To further share the findings of this review paper, in August this year, we organized a webinar in collaboration with Business for Nature, WBCSD and the Capitals Coalition to discuss the paper and the Business for Nature's position on the draft post-2020 framework. This webinar generated a lot of positive discussions, and we heard from a number of businesses who were supportive of a stronger private sector representation in the post-2020 framework. So here is a brief summary of the findings of the review. First, we realized that the drivers for companies to measure, report, and disclose their impacts on biodiversity are strengthening due to rising awareness of material risks that biodiversity loss presents. That includes market forces such as consumer pressure, physical risk, and reputational risk. Secondly, we also found that private sector specific approaches for companies to measure and disclose their biodiversity impacts and dependencies are now emerging and being tested by businesses. At the time of the report, there were 12 specific measurement approaches available for corporate measurement, and this number has increased since. Biodiversity disclosure, on the other hand, has been limited to environmental flows and pressures on biodiversity, such as emissions of solid waste, rather than the state of biodiversity. And finally, we recognize that the development of private sector-specific measurement approaches helps address a range of business needs and has the potential to support improved disclosure. So this may, in fact, help companies to facilitate their contributions to the Sustainable Development Goals and the goals and targets that will be put forward in the post-2020 framework. Following our review, 3 overarching recommendations were provided. The first is building awareness on the value of biodiversity and how to measure impacts and dependencies. This will require policymakers to support the uptake of these emerging measurement approaches and the development of guidance and outreach via business associations and biodiversity or natural capital platforms. Second, it is important to ensure that the post-2020 biodiversity framework is business relevant. This can be achieved by considering how the proposed goals, targets, and indicators apply to the private sector, and by formally acknowledging the private sector as a key actor, as key actors to mainstream biodiversity into policies and actions of financial institutions. Finally, it will be important to move towards mandatory disclosure on biodiversity performance, moving towards an international natural capital accounting framework that promotes the integration of business and government natural capital accounting will be very important. And biodiversity will need to be adequately included with explicit guidance on measurement and valuation, in addition to reporting for listed and non-listed companies. However, this won't occur immediately, and instead, it should first be supported by voluntary measurement and reporting. As this paper was published in 2020, it's great to see that the official first draft of the post-2020 framework includes a specific private sector-related target. Businesses and financial institutions will need to report on their biodiversity impacts and dependencies from the local to the global scale. The target also requests that negative impacts be reduced by at least half and positive impacts be increased to move our economy towards sustainable extraction and production practices. If supported by national governments and adopted, the framework will signal to businesses that they need to better understand how to measure and disclose on their biodiversity impact and dependence to their stakeholders. But now that we recognize the need for international applicable policy that encourages the adoption of private sector biodiversity measurement and disclosure, it's important to ask how would a company or business go about implementing these requests, and how would they measure their impacts and dependence on biodiversity specifically. There are already a number of initiatives focused on increasing the value of nature within the global economy, increasing disclosure practices, and helping businesses understand how to set nature-related targets. This includes, for instance, a science-based targets network, the upcoming task force on nature-related financial disclosures, the Natural Capital Protocol, We Value Nature, and the Global Reporting Initiative. These initiatives have different purposes and operate in different ways. However, biodiversity measurement specifically still requires standardization in terms of the metrics and indicators used to assess the pressures on biodiversity and the change in biodiversity state. To support the standardization of natural capital accounting practices, and especially biodiversity, for businesses across the supply chain, the European Commission has funded the Aligning Accounting Approaches for Nature, or ALIGN project. And this project, the aim of the project is expected to be achieved through three main objectives. The first revolves around developing a dedicated natural capital accounting platform to facilitate best practice exchange among businesses that are completing biodiversity inclusive natural capital accounting. The main focus of the work, however, focuses on biodiversity measurement and on aligning the methods and metrics that are used for measuring biodiversity impact and dependence. This is a bottom-up focus initiative where we actually convene businesses and financial institutions to already existing initiatives. Finally, we are working to help the European Commission understand the needs and identify the education, training, and research and innovation opportunities. The biodiversity measurement component of the ALIGN project consists of 4 work streams. The first one revolves around business engagement, and this will be discussed on the next slide. Here, we are working together to co-create our outputs, which include the standard recommendations for corporate biodiversity measurement and valuation. We will also be developing complementary guidance that is sector-specific and broken down across the value chain. We anticipate to draft 3 separate documents, one for site-based companies, one for supply chain companies, and another one for the finance sector. And finally, we will identify gaps and research needs to further the field and ensure companies understand their impacts and dependence on biodiversity in a scientifically robust manner. Once developed, the draft recommendations for a biodiversity standard are expected to enter public consultation in the first quarter of 2022. The ALIGN methodology is being drafted in tandem to prescriptive guidance for the Transparent project, which provides further details on measuring and valuing all areas of natural capital. It's considered the sister project of Transparent. The ALIGN project will provide information on how to measure and value biodiversity more specifically. And this document will fit within the Transparent methodology and be applicable to biodiversity measurement and assessment more generally. Finally, sectoral guidance is anticipated to begin in the second quarter of 2022 and run through a similar consultation and piloting process. And the dissemination of these outputs is expected to occur mainly in 2023. To ensure that the standard recommendations and guidance documents are practical, each will be developed in collaboration with our ALIGN community, and particularly the Community of Practice and Technical Hub of the ALIGN project. To date, we have held a number of workshops to understand needs and identify gaps and barriers hindering effective measurement. And following these meetings, we developed an outline already for the standard recommendations, and we are currently in the process of writing the first draft of the standard, which is anticipated to be released in early 2022. During this process, we will identify key technical questions to bring forward to the technical hub on various topics, including accounting, available datasets, and disclosure practices within the community. If you are interested in joining the community of practice or technical hub, please email me or one of my colleagues, as we are always looking to expand our network and expertise. And for those wishing to remain updated on the process and the project, we also provide periodic newsletter updates through the Align community of interest. So do let us know again if you're interested in that. Finally, it's important to note that Align is not intended to create a new initiative and guidance for businesses to adopt and follow. Our intention is to build on and support the success of already established initiatives working together to better integrate biodiversity assessment and accounting within business operations. Using a selection criteria of maturity, influence, and impact, we identified 11 priority initiatives for Align to work closely with and remain aware of as we develop our standard and guidance documents. This includes various components of the work of DG FISMA, the EU-funded Transparent project already mentioned, the Partnership for Biodiversity Accounting Financials, the Science-Based Targets Network, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, and the UN System of Environmental Economic Accounting, among others. This is the end of this presentation. Thank you all for your attention. If there are questions from the audience now, Martin, Rodrigo, or myself are happy to try and answer. Otherwise, feel free to email myself or my colleague Julie in Cambridge, and we will be happy to answer your question. And otherwise, also, if you are interested in joining the Align Community of Practice or Technical Hub, again, I encourage you to email us. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this a good presentation and overview of the Align project and the Transparent project. And one remark from my side, but seeing all these 11 front-running projects, it really is good. And it reminds me a little bit of the saying in Africa, and I'm maybe rephrasing it a little bit, but when you're traveling alone, you go faster, but when you travel with more, you go further. So that's why it is so important, I think, for Align also to look to who are the others that are doing similar things and what can we do together with them. If there is a brief, one or two questions, we could take them, or otherwise we would go to the panel. Yes, please. Shout. You take off your mask, otherwise we don't hear you.
You're going to hold it. So Stephen Dickinson, I'm the Group Biodiversity Lead for Total Energies. And so we've been involved in the BISI initiative. We're looking at TNFD and have looked at Align. It's sometimes a little difficult to decipher the complementarity, especially between TNFD and Align, how they're going to match together. And my question specifically to you was, how are you going to integrate the BISI initiative which is providing a framework which is maturing quite fast within the Align and TNFD approaches?
Thank you for that question. Immediately is a very technical one. You want to take the answer, Rodrigo?
The BISI, for those that don't know, it's the Biodiversity Indicator for Site-Based Impacts Initiative, which we've been developing and piloting with extractives companies for the past 2-3 years. It's one of the initiatives that we are considering in the context of the Aligning Biodiversity Measures for Business initiative. So it's one of several initiatives that are out there that we are basically bringing people together to discuss and trying to move in the same direction, at least. I guess that's the movement that we are on right now, is at least to bring all those initiatives developing indicators, metrics together so that we can at least flow in the same direction and influence the TNFD, which is just starting. So there was some preparatory work in the past 2 years, but the actual initiative was just launched back in June. And yeah, it's part of the process now of influencing those larger scope, broader policy initiatives with what's already going on the ground and already tested and piloted as we did it with Total.
Yeah, just to add to that, we recently, as Capitals Coalition, we launched a process where we brought all front runners in the accounting world working on these standards together to work towards the same direction. We know that there are different developments next to each other. In part, that's my personal view, that shows that we are in the midst of the transformation. So we have to develop different things as closely together as possible in order to find together the solution that we need. And we are still in that process. So looking if there's one other question. If not, we move to Mark van Oorschot. He couldn't travel to here. He's still in the Netherlands, but he recorded a video message. Mark works at the Environmental Planning Agency for the Netherlands. He is the key advisor to the Dutch government on business and nature related issues and has published several reports, including a very interesting one around disclosure and whether or not companies are moving and disclose their impacts on nature and biodiversity just by themselves, or whether they need a nudge from government. So can you please bring in Mark van Oorschot?
Thanks for inviting me to introduce the formal discussion of this really nice session on biodiversity measures. Unfortunately, we could not be present in Marseille, but well, I'm pleased to be invited to address you in this way. What I would like to do is to share with you some messages that we published in some policy reports by PBL in the last few years that very much relate to the subject of measuring, monitoring and reporting. So I would like to share some bullet points on that. Don't worry, it won't be a very long presentation. So what I would like to talk about is the role of transparency reporting for global biodiversity policies, mainly in the context of the new CBD framework to be developed. These are some messages compiled by me and a colleague of mine, Marcel Kok. We work together on a lot of these subjects. So we published this report, Reflections on Transparency, a few years ago. It was looking at the new EU directive on transparency. And the intention of such an instrument is to stimulate dialogue between business and finance, on one hand, and the range of stakeholders. And the important bit is that it's stakeholders and not just shareholders. So a lot of different values, not just stakeholder shareholder values are at stake, but a wide range of values, like the ones that now are being addressed in IPBES. A range of values should be taken into account. We also see a large potential for financial institutions as their risk perception is broadening, and a lot of tools are rapidly developing. That's a very nice subject at this moment, and I hope a lot of people will contribute to that because there's lots of work to be done. So the idea in the end, the theory of change, so to say, is that dialogue and engagement, and even also regulation, leads to better company performance on the ESG issues. This theory of change still can be challenged because we don't see all these effects right now yet. For instance, the EU directive on transparency, or non-reporting directive as it is called formally. We saw that being implemented a few years ago, but we didn't see much change because it had a limited scope, a limited width. Not a lot of companies were obliged to report. There's no uniformity in reporting, and enforcement was also still weak. But I read just recently that in April of this year, a new proposal has been adopted by the Commission, a directive on CSR, which is corporate social reporting. And now the proposal is that all large companies, so both stock-listed and non-stock-listed companies, are obliged to report, and including all kinds of other smaller companies that are listed. So that is the state of play in terms of European policy and the hopes we have for this instrument. So now talk about what that means for the CBD targets. We are preparing a new policy brief on monitoring, reporting and verification. And it starts all with the transformative change that we need in the way we consume and produce to stop further biodiversity loss and hopefully also contribute to a positive change. So the CBD already acknowledges that there's a larger role for non-state actors like business and finance in achieving their own goals. So monitoring, reporting and verification by private actors should be a real and explicit part of this whole CBD accountability framework. How is, however, something we still have to see and I think what would be the best solution there. So the type of information we really need is that risk analysis and risk management are both in the information disclosed, both for the impacts on biodiversity as their dependencies. You can't do one or just the other, you need really both. And a really important part is also that information is disclosed on these subjects in companies' supply chains. And including that supply chain also acts as a kind of multiplier to numerous other companies. So what I would like to state is that it is important to use the already existing reporting infrastructures for the private sector for the CBD post-2020 framework. And with that I mean things like the GRI standards, the carbon disclosure protocol, and all kinds of other standards, and also policies like the ones that are now being implemented in the EU. So my last remark here is that we have to think about how to organize a global stock take of what companies are doing in terms of reporting and verification. Should governments be the ones taking a lead in overseeing that companies are doing that, or can we find other kinds of ways and structures to do so? So these are a few of the points I'd like to address and mention to you, and hopefully this will be some input that you can use in your further discussions today. So I hope you have a good forum discussion. Hopefully I can see some of that online now or later. So thank you very much for inviting me, and have a nice time in Marseille. Goodbye.
Well, you may clap for Mark, but I'm not sure whether he will hear it. So we've now heard from two scientists working in the field of disclosure and measurement, what they are doing and what they are seeing. And there definitely is movement in the right direction, but at the same time, there's still some struggles too. And what we now are going to do is discuss this with three panelists. As I said before, one from business, Diane Holdorf, please come to the floor, and all three panelists can come to the floor right now. Maybe we should set you a little bit together nicely as a group instead of two there and one here. There will be a slide here, but that's not a problem. Diane Holdorf, I will introduce you properly later. Keith Tuffley, Citigroup, please come to the floor too. And sorry for your name, Aurélien Giraud, also to the floor. Can you go back one slide, please, for? Sorry about this. I just wanted to show you this infinity loop that we are using more and more. I put you in a wrong. Sorry about that, but please go back to the group later on. Otherwise you feel a little bit strange. It's not good for the government to be so strange. But I brought this on because we are using it more and more to understand what we are doing as Capitals Coalition. So what you see here is an infinity loop. Business is blue, finance is green, and government is orange. So the colors doesn't mean anything beyond that, by the way. What you see at the business side, these are the steps of the protocol. So what is business doing if they want to understand their impacts and dependencies on nature? How do they start measuring it? What do they decide? And then disclose or report. Then finance sector steps in. They use this information to audit, to assess relevance, to start rating and benchmarking. But also governments come in because they always want to know what is a business doing, is it aligned with societal ideas and rules, yes or no, and do we need to change those rules? So it's an infinity loop. If it works together, it really can help to accelerate. But there's a kind of a trick into it. It only works well if we understand and we use the same interpretation of what does value of nature and people mean to you. So you need a kind of an interconnected language there. And that goes back, I think, to the setting today. How are you measuring, how are you valuing your impacts and dependencies? That needs to be standardized. It was a key remark brought to the floor earlier. It needs to be standardized, and that's also one of the key things we see as Capitals Coalition. Having a protocol saying these are the steps, these are the things you should do is good, but if you don't have a standardized understanding of value, still there will be too many differences in the different applications. So this just as a starter. And Diane Holdorf, WBCSD, responsible there for agriculture and nature, which is a very good and an interesting combination, I should say. Can you please introduce briefly what WBCSD is doing in this respect, and also how do you value the global biodiversity framework and the call for more measurement and disclosure?
Great, thanks so much, Martin. Hi, everybody. So good to see you all. WBCSD is the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. As Martin said, I lead the food and nature program there. We also do work across economic systems with more than 200 member companies on climate and energy, people and inequality, and these big drivers, including what do we have to do to redefine value for the performance and recognition in companies. So much in bringing together ambition, helping to drive action, and to give those, particularly in the policy arena, who have the leadership to create the type of ambitious global framework that we're waiting on for the post-2020 GBF, to take as ambitious action as possible where we can come in then and lead and actually implement. So together with Business for Nature, together with many of the partner organizations who've already been mentioned here, we're working together with our member companies and those partners to understand what a net positive roadmap is for companies by sector. Some sectors are further along this value chain, this journey than others. The agricultural and land use sector actually is trailing. They don't have the same number of guides and frameworks to judge their performance on, and it's quite difficult for investors and others to know should look and be rewarded. So these nature positive, that it's a multi-stakeholder dialogue to put that together. And then, much like the Infinity Loop says, we have to be able to not just assess what the actions are, but also together with the Science Based Target Network to provide business input to that process. We know that that will take time. We need the science that will underpin what net nature positive is. But meanwhile, we still have to have consistent and credible KPIs. So we're working on what those are with the companies who are already measuring consistent aspects like water replenishment, hectares, square miles of ocean, things that are tangible that affect their business decision making that they can pull in and gather into their other data and reporting. We then have to, and each of these has that aspect of impact and dependency that really drives business strategy, business operational performance, and importantly, risk management as well. So we make sure that those are very business relevant. But we know that the data needs even broader coherence than that starting point for KPIs, which is the work together with SBTN. We're doing the same then with the Task Force for Nature-related financial disclosures, making sure that the TNFD is aligned with the TCFD so that we can be learning as much from the climate journey as we implement nature action as possible and get alignment on what that financial reporting should look like to make it easier for companies to leverage the data they have and get very focused on the next pieces that they need to understand within their own operations as well as their total value chain. So by working all of these pieces together, we're looking to create readiness, understanding, drive ambition, support the leading companies who are already setting these targets and taking action, and move others along the entire value chain faster.
Well, thank you very much for that, Diane. And it's good to see how a business really wants to build on scientific evidence. And also, I have one more question for you. So, just passing it by again. So the call for more mandatory disclosure. So how is that welcomed in your community? Is it embraced fully? Are there discussions around that?
It's generally embraced because mandatory disclosure and reporting sets a level playing field and really demonstrates the positive performance of companies who've taken proactive action to address the risk and to create the business opportunity, and allows other companies then to come along in a way that is required and consistent and moves it faster. So it's generally supported. The key to that, however, is making sure that the data that is required for reporting is the right level of ambitious, but also practical and able to be gathered from a business perspective. And so that's where we're also bringing business input to things like the Science-Based Target Network and the TNFD to make sure that what is being requested can actually then be delivered.
Okay, thank you very much. And the call for good data, I think, is a good moment now to bring you in. Keith Duffley, Vice Chair of Citigroup, working already a long time on the transformation and corporate sustainability within Citi. You've been also working on climate change, and so climate is a little bit ahead of the game compared to biodiversity. Can you share some of the learnings from bringing in climate into Citigroup's work and decision making? How does that work?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Martin. So, yes, I lead our global sustainability work here at Citigroup. The client-facing part of the work, so obviously we're a very large US-based bank. The type of work we do is obviously as a major lender to companies, but also as a capital markets advisor and underwriter, and also as a strategic advisor, M&A activity, etc. So there's a whole range of ways in which we interact with clients globally. And I have the good fortune of running that business globally for Citi across all regions. So I'm able to see the differences in regions, but also differences across sectors. One of the interesting things in the climate, to your question, Martin, is that we sort of underestimate what's been achieved, I think, in climate since 2015. And it really is quite extraordinary what's happened. Now, of course, the numbers haven't actually changed the top. We're still at a very sticky, we haven't really reduced our global emissions much. In fact, it's gone up since 2015, certainly in the absence of COVID. But nevertheless, beneath that, there's been a lot of action. And it's amazing what the target in the Paris Agreement was able to achieve in terms of all these initiatives, most of which have been private sector driven, I would argue. And obviously TCFD has been mentioned, Science-Based Targets Initiative, the whole concept of net zero companies. How do you embed that? The Net Zero Banking Alliance, which we've just joined recently. GFANZ, which is the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. It really is quite incredible how many private sector initiatives are now driving this shift towards a net zero future. And it's totally transformational for the global economy. Now, I would argue that we need to replicate all of that. All of the major initiatives we have to replicate, just like what Dan said and earlier was said about TCFD, i.e. TNFD. That's a disclosure system. We have to do the same with, I'll start from the start, the peak goal. I mean, net zero 2050 has been an amazing motivating force for the private sector. It's very precise, it's very clear, and it's not enough. I mean, it's got to be 50% by 2030, but back in 2015, it was all about getting, a very clear target. We have to do the same for nature. We have to have a very clear peak goal. Even if it's very imperfect, it's very important for the capital markets to have a very clear, peak ambition that companies, capital markets, investors can mobilise around. And so all of these initiatives we should be trying to replicate for nature. Climate Action 100+, I would argue that the investors are still, rightly or wrongly, the major influencer over public companies. And companies listen to investors. I've seen this 5 years ago when most of the CEOs would say, we don't hear from investors about this. Well, now they do. I mean, it's accelerated so much in the last 2 years. And so we need to have, and we are starting to have, the nature climate, the nature action 100 plus. So I'm very optimistic about what we can do, but we've got to take the learnings from climate and now we've got to accelerate it, because we can't take 5 years like we did with climate. We've got to take a couple of years to get all these accelerated and remobilising the capital towards these nature positive businesses and nature positive investors.
Thank you very much for that. And so what you're saying is we really are improving what we are doing. At the same time, we still see that climate change is not really changing. So it is a little bit, I don't want to put you on the spot, but it's like the surgeon that is operating and say, well, my technique improved, but the other persons around him say, well, but the patient is dying. So what is the key thing you think that we need to flip that?
Well, I mean, we just got to recognise we've got a very resilient capital system that actually needs surgery itself. It's the system itself that actually needs surgery. There's too much of the incremental change. We've left this climate action for 30 years and now it needs transformational change. I think we will pay for it if we don't recognise the same in nature and biodiversity. We need to accelerate. Now, there's not enough awareness now on nature and biodiversity piece. There's not nearly enough awareness amongst investors and companies. Our conversations are still at the moment all about climate. There's not nearly enough about, and most CEOs would sort of roll their eyes a bit about nature and biodiversity. Yes, the lions are important, the elephants are important, but it's not relevant to us as a business. So the great words that were said by Christine Lagarde last night and others, that actually the financial sector does depend on nature, a healthy planet. And we as advisors and lenders, we have to instill this into our lending activities. We have to make sure that if we're going to lend to a company, they have to put in place TNFD, science-based targets for nature, all of these initiatives. That should be a condition of companies lending to and investing in businesses. So yes, we've got a sticky, resilient capital system, but the moment that you can spot where opportunities arise, business opportunities, as we're now seeing with climate, the amount of capital now shifting towards climate solutions is huge. We've got to do the same with nature and biodiversity. Then it flips very quickly. But we're not there with nature and biodiversity. There's still a lot of awareness building in nature and biodiversity.
Okay, thank you also for being so honest that we have a sticky financial system that needs to change. And so maybe government is the sticky financial system changer. So I want to bring you on. Aurélien Giraud, Sustainability Finance Policy Officer from the Ministry for Ecological Transition. And an important report, I think, came out just a couple of days ago by the Central Bank in France, stating that the financial system as a whole, I think, has more than 41% of it really is under risk of nature loss. So that must come into the heart and the mind of the government and also the financial regulators. So what is the kind of discussion within French government following that report and also following the discussions that we are here having around measuring and valuing and the need to disclose to really help reversing nature loss?
Yeah, thank you, Martin. Can you hear me? Yeah, if I'm not, I won't stick the mic to my COVID era. Yeah, thank you very much for introducing the report by the French Banque de France. Actually, for those who are interested, the report is called, I was not involved and the ministry was not involved in the report, but just to mention, if you want to download it, it's called Silent Spring, which dates back to a famous a book and documentary from the 60s or 70s, I think, on the birds' disappearance due to the pesticides. So that's also the name of the study, realized by the Banque de France, but also by other financial institutions. And as Martin said, we realized that the French financial sector has a bit more than 40% of stocks and bonds. So in their portfolios, that is highly dependent to at least one ecosystem service. highly dependent. So, and I think we can think about this figure. We can also think about another figure which shows that definitely we have to act more quickly than we are doing now, and what we have been doing so far. It's 600 billion euros, and that's the lower range of the figure. It could raise until 900 billion euros per year. That's the amount of harmful subsidies to biodiversity. And when you think about it, the amount of the French savings in the savings account and life insurance in France on stock, not on flows, but on stock, until in 2019, so before COVID era. I guess it has raised a lot since then. So the amount of French savings are 5,000 million euros. Okay, so if you compare the figures, so you have, sorry, I will say it in French. No, sorry. So 5,000 billion euros in stocks. So when you think about it, you could just have to say, okay, so the money is there. So what's going wrong? And I think where the ministry and the regulators have a role to play, as you said, a game changer, to change the rule. And I really rejoice when I see the recommendation of the report that was mentioned by Elise Bell, and the third one, which is mandatory disclosures. Of course, disclosure is not enough. Let's be clear about this. Disclosure is not enough. That's a thing. It is not as efficient and it is not as effective as mandatory performance obligations, such as minimum threshold or minimum green share in the portfolio, for instance. Obviously, this is much more complex than it is, because the green characteristic of a stock of a company is not enough for an investor to invest or for a lender to lend. You will see the credit risk, you will see the market risk, liquidity risk. So you have a lot of, and not only of the project you will finance, but also of the company you are lending to. So obviously this is not only about raise your green share and that's it. And actually that's a bit the job of the European Commission with its taxonomy. So when you think about it, you say, okay, so let's start, and that's what we did in France in 2015 with the Article 173, which set some disclosure obligations for non-financial and for financial entities. So in my team, we are dealing with sustainable finance and CSR business. So we have the two ends of the chain. We deal with financial entities, and I personally deal with financial entities, and other members in the team deal with the non-financial entities. And we say, so let's put disclosure obligation on what are the ESG practices and processes in non-financial companies. How are they aligning their portfolio with, at that time, 2 degrees target? What are the governance? How is the remuneration linked with the climate-related objectives, and so on. But what we saw, and this was 2 years ago when we set and we drafted a balance, an analysis of the reporting from 2015 to 2018. We had introduced in this mechanism in the law, we had introduced a comply-or-explain approach. And we said, so either you comply or you explain why you're not complying with the regulation. The thing is, we still found 4 years after that 6%, so it may not be very high for you, but that is high. 6% of the entities did not comply nor explain. And so you say, come on, we are just giving you the opportunity with a flexible mechanism, because this law it's amending the financial and monetary code. And we said, come on, we are giving you flexibility, but even with this flexible mechanism, you are still not abiding by the law. So we had to reinforce the decree and set further disclosure and provision on this, but I guess we'll go back to this after. Martin, I don't know how you want to proceed.
Thanks for that. And to be honest, I think there are many countries in the world that would be quite pleased with 94% more or less doing what the regulator asked. But I see your point. And I want to do a little experiment here to get some ideas from the floor. What we've heard from the panelists and also from the speaker in the beginning is that yes, there is a clear need for measurement, for valuation of impacts and dependencies. Disclosure has to play a role too. It's not going just by itself, so maybe a little bit more mandatory. There is support even in the business community, but there are also challenges. So if you have a law with flexibility, then still people don't implement and they leave it to that. So I want to focus on the question, what are the challenges that really prevent that we start to disclose much more as a kind of a new normal in finance and business. And in order to get some thoughts from you on that, I just want to, you can take off your cap just for one moment. And if you shout out one word, it's an experiment, I already said it, but to get some ideas from the floor, what is the challenge you think we need to address? So if you want to say something, take off your mask and shout one word, not two, please. So who? Shout? Okay. No one is ready? Complexity, fear. I like fear. Another word. Capacity. Sorry. Show. Share. Sorry. Share. Fear, sharing, complexity. Those are three good words. So, Diane, complexity. What is your experience? Is it complex?
There's no question that nature and finding the right metrics for nature is complex. I mean, we all thought climate was complex. It's one aspect of the biodiversity system. So we've got to be looking at not just the big animals, but land conversion, forest loss, soil health. Then you move on to water, clean water, fresh water, blue ocean water. Then you move on. So the list is long. It's going to be very difficult to get to a 1.5 type equivalent that everyone can truly rally behind. That doesn't mean it is impossible, however. And this is the whole point of understanding materiality, biggest areas of risk, size of a company footprint, and high-risk landscapes. And with that type of information, you start to break down the complexity quite quickly, and you start to understand what should be the KPIs and measures we need to be watching for, what is relevant to the types of operations that we have and that are in our value chain, what can we take as mitigating actions against those risks with others, what stakeholders do we need to engage with, and how do we start to financialize that? And how do we get a pull from the financial community to recognize that type of risk mitigation action?
Okay, thanks for that. Don't be afraid. Is also what you say. There is already a lot of knowledge there, so you just should start. Keith, you want to come in on this?
Well, I agree with Diana. I mean, yes, it is complex. It is probably more complex than climate for all the obvious reasons about the beauty of complexity. That's what nature and biodiversity is all about. It's us thriving in the beauty of complexity. I think we can actually thrive on that. I actually think, frankly, I think the financial markets love complexity. I mean, we're talking about valuation techniques and financial instruments, etc. I mean, we create ridiculously complex instruments that often the system doesn't even understand. We've seen that back in 2008. And it's a lot more simple than the complexity of systemic failure. If we have a systemic failure driven by climate and by nature and biodiversity loss, that's a level of complexity that we don't want to go to. So I think it's complex, but I think it's beautifully complex, and I think actually we can thrive off that. I think we can actually... It brings very smart and interested people into solving a really interesting challenge that we all face. So I think it's nothing to be afraid of, something we should embrace. I'd throw one more word in if I can. But since
Go ahead.
I'll shout it out. I think it's. I think awareness, definitely. I mentioned that before. I think we have to make, from a financial markets, banking, investor perspective, we have to make the financial markets far more aware. We've done it with climate. We've succeeded. Virtually everyone is now aware. They're not doing enough, but at least they're aware. I think we need to do the same with nature and biodiversity, and I think that's something we're on the path to achieving. But I think that's a really important part of it.
Thanks for that. So we have complexity, we have awareness, we also had share. So I now want to do another experiment, because I want to move you to that side, because usually you see that the private sector and government is not sitting right to each other. They are kind of in different worlds. And my experience, I worked for 30 years for the Dutch government. And what I found out is that usually front runners within government, within business, within finance, they all know what to do and what is necessary. But what they also all do is, when they figure out what we need to do, they throw it over the hedge to the other one and say, solve it. So I think we need radical collaboration between the three of those. And radical collaboration is not my phrase, it's from Nigel Topping, so the UK ambassador for climate change. And by putting you together, I want to start creating radical change and collaboration here. Could you come in on the question of sharing? What can a government do to support that business and finance is sharing their experience a little bit more?
Yeah, but that's an interesting point, because precisely what I will always come back to the French experiments and experience.
That's okay. You're from France.
On the decree, and so I mentioned a former unmentioned decree 6 years ago, and then we saw that we had to fix some provisions in this decree because the financial market participants didn't understand the decree. That was as simple as that. And even we in the team, when we were used to read the decree, we didn't understand it either. So it doesn't matter who wrote it. So we said, okay, we have to make the decree evolve, because the biodiversity emergency, which was not included in the decree, but also because we have to reword it and rephrase it. So that's a simple aspect of form and reduction in structure, but it has a major impact on the financial market participants. That's the first thing. And then when we wrote the decree this year and last year, because it was published 2 months ago, and the financial market participants will have to comply with it from June 2022. But they have until June 2023 to implement all the provisions. So that's also flexibility. We said, okay, disclosure is not perfect, but it allows to raise awareness, it allows to structure the reporting, it also allows to improve the environmental or ESG performance and the financial market participants. So that's a good first step. And we said, okay, let's include provisions related to biodiversity, but we won't draft anything new. We just didn't want to reinvent the wheel. So we consulted the major financial federation and financial market participants, an extensive consultation. I guess it lasted more than 2 or 3 months. And we also submitted the main ideas we had. Obviously, the financial sector was not happy with some biodiversity alignment, biodiversity footprint measurement, aligning with some CBD objectives. So we tried to simplify a bit what we wanted, but we didn't change the ambition of these 3 key provisions. And if you want to have and read the decree, it's only 5 pages, not 50. You will see that the 3 objectives and the 3 provisions are still there. But what was really important is to have a feedback and extensive feedback from the financial sector, from the business sector, because we also had businesses in the end that are the one who have to provide the data, obviously. We said, okay, so let's try once, twice, 3 times, and then we just said, because it was time for the Ministry for the Environment to have a sustainable finance team, and we said, okay, we won't be flexible on the ambition. We may give you a different way of reporting or complying with the reporting obligation. That's why we gave an additional year. That's why the deadline of 2023, June 2023, to have an exhaustive reporting information. But we will keep this in the decree. And so that's the first thing. And the other thing was related to risk management. We absolutely wanted in the decree to have the merger between ESG risks and financial risks. Well, ESG factor, ESG related factor, and financial risks. And we said, please explain to us how your ESG risk management is integrated and articulated with the traditional or classical risk management framework of your entity. So we consulted directly the financial businesses and federation, and they said, okay, it won't be easy. And we said, that's not the point. Of course it's not easy. If we had thought the same thing 6 or 7 years ago about the climate, we wouldn't be at and without boasting ourselves, at the level of reporting of climate disclosure we have from French financial market participants today. So that's the thing, that's very difficult. We are asking footprint measurement in biodiversity, disclosure and transparency on impact and dependencies, biodiversity-related risks, whether it comes from impact or dependencies, sectoral approach and materiality approach according to the sector, geographical location, where does the risks, the main risks, only the material risk, not all the risk, come from? And all this was obviously analyzed jointly with the financial market participants.
Yes, so I love the way your interpretation of share is not about sharing the knowledge, but it's sharing the burden of creating a good law that is understandable. And this morning we had Sylvie Gillette, the French ambassador for the environment, saying that the draft global biodiversity framework had a little bit fuzzy language. So this sharing the burden of co-creating good solutions, I think, always has to do a lot with language. And the infinity loop I just introduced to you, the key element there is finding the same language that everyone understands across business, finance and government. So thanks for that. I want to bring in fear, because I loved fear as an element. And one of the discussions at the open-ended working group on this target 15 that was shown was, it says all business should. And all business, I don't know how many businesses there are a couple of hundreds part of WBCSD. I know I was once giving a talk in Germany, and I say, well, 6 businesses have signed a call to action, but there are 3 million businesses in Germany. So there is a kind of a need to bring in also the smaller businesses, and there's a fear that they cannot cope with disclosure and measurement and all these kind of things. So I want to have a quick reaction from you on that. Just short, I don't expect the solution, but how are you working on that as WBCSD or as city? And then we go to the government to close.
Fear is often driven by not understanding and not having access to the information and not understanding how it's applicable to the business's core operations. We have to overcome those things. We've talked a lot about what it will take to do that. But the other thing we need to remember is that a lot of businesses are capacity constrained. They don't have the resources of the large leading multinationals who can demonstrate what's possible. So we need to translate that into ways that integrate with the systems that they already have and that they're already reporting against. Like TCFD, why it's so important for TNFD to be modeled so closely to that for understanding and ease of response. Anything we can do to make that cascade more seamless will allow companies that are smaller or not as engaged in this conversation today to be able to react faster to the requirements that are coming in.
Yes, so make it simple, not simplistic. I don't think you're saying that, and that helps to build the capacity. Also, the program that we still are running with WBCSD and others. We Value Nature. Yeah. Exactly does that. Keith, can you please come in?
Yeah, I mean, I think, fear, I have to feel like on the flip side of fear, which is opportunity. And yes, we should be fearful about the impacts of climate if we don't address climate. We should be fearful of the impacts on us as humans if we don't address our relationship with nature and biodiversity. But a lot of us react to fear, to the scientific facts, and a lot don't. A lot don't actually react to that. I think a lot, certainly in the capital markets, respond to opportunity. And we've also got to recognise that there's enormous economic opportunities arising from transforming our economic system, how we extract, turning into a circular model, how we embrace nature and live with nature and not just think of it as being a resource to extract from. There are so many amazing business opportunities, entrepreneurs developing new businesses arising from this new model. And I think that's the flip side of what we're talking about. We've got to inspire more businesses and more people and more governments into, I mean, I'm Australian. I don't think our government recognises
the last words were not very positive on climate change and Australia.
No. And so we've got to inspire, that's why I said governments as well, including my own government, to help drive the opportunities for businesses, investors, banks and communities, people globally. So I think that's the positive flip side of the fear factor, is turning that into opportunity. We also got to recognise we actually have a fundamental weakness in our economic system. It's a distortion in the system that we do not properly price externalities. And of course, Christine Lagarde spoke about this last night. It's a distortion that we don't have it. It's not, we actually have to repair the economics and the system by properly pricing externalities. That's carbon and all other externalities that we produce. We've got to flip the argument to saying we are distorting the system if we don't have it. And that's just the truth. We're living on a finite planet. It's fine if we don't have it when you're living on an infinite planet, but we have a finite planet, and that's why we have to have those proper pricing and ultimately probably valuing, pricing, disclosing, and probably taxing externalities at some stage as well.
Okay, thank you. Good to bring in this pricing element too. And in France, would pricing resources be a solution to overcome the fear within the business community to move into this direction? Or would it be the wrong answer? So can you reflect on that?
Yes, I think obviously we see this fear from the business community and the financial sector. We also see it. You know, we are consulted a lot on what's going on regarding current regulation. But I believe that, and that's part of what a regulator can do, is to be ambitious, but to explain clearly what's the rationale and what's the approach behind the regulation that has been set. So at the beginning, in our experience, once again, we had a very huge backlash from the financial community. Obviously, the NGOs and civil society were more than happy to see this forthcoming regulation, and that was good. But we say, wait, we are just asking you to disclose this, this, and this. And among them, we had the biodiversity footprint. But we are not being prescriptive, which I gather is a very important word and adjective for the business community. So it's not time for now for the standardization. There are a lot of resourcing, emerging frameworks and methodologies. So use the one you want. Obviously, the first years, it won't be comparable between the companies. We know this, and especially with the biodiversity. But what we want is some methodologies and the best one to emerge. And the financial market participants in the business will try, will start again, and will come with some results that will be improved year after year. And then when we reassure the community, business and financial communities with this, they said, okay, so you are not obliging, imposing any specific methodologies or resources. No, you have a lot of resources. Use them, and in 2 or 3 times, we make a balance of this. And
Okay.
we'll see how it works.
Thank you very much. I want to ask you to give a warm applause to our panelists. They showed with the examples they brought to the floor that yes, it's complex. Complexity can be fun and can be interesting. Yes, it's important to share, and awareness is a key element. The French report by the French Central Bank could also play a role in that, and that there's no need to be fearful to really embark upon this journey. So with that, I want to conclude this panel. Again, thank you very much, and hand over to Rodrigo to introduce the last video. Thank you.
So thank you very much again, the panelists and Martin. We have one final video before we finish the session. We'll hear from Caroline van Landers from the Dutch government. She's a senior process manager for sustainable transition, and I believe her messages really closes up well this session.
Hello, my name is Caroline van Landers. I was asked to share some of the insights of our work in the Netherlands over the past years. For the past 7 years, we have been working from the Ministry of Agriculture, Nature and Food Quality in the Netherlands on greening the financial sector by using transition policy. Part of our policy actions has been from the start to help frontrunners in developing methods for measuring impact on biodiversity. But very little companies then and even now disclose the data needed for biodiversity footprinting. For this reason, we have been supportive in the development of the Biodiversity Footprinting for Financial Institutions tool, an open source method to measure impact on biodiversity using different kinds of public models and databases. We published the different reports in collaboration over time. They will be shown at the end, and cooperated in the setup and launch of the Partnership Biodiversity Accounting Financials. The Bffi method was developed by PRE, CREM and ASM Bank and is based on a life cycle assessment approach using an already existing pressure impact model, recipe, and environmental data from LCA databases like Axiobase for listed equity and thus companies. In the Biodiversity Footprinting for Financial tool, the end result is expressed as the potential disappeared fraction of species per hectare per year, simplified as hectare. In a study, I commissioned a group of Dutch financials, Achmea, ASN, ASR, APG and ENG participated in the calculation of the biodiversity footprint of the multinationals of the MSCI World Index. The result of the footprint calculation is an overview of the company's total biodiversity footprint expressed in the simplified hectares. In the MSCI footprint, we find, not surprisingly, that the biggest companies also have the biggest footprint. To account for the large differences in revenue, the results can also be expressed in biodiversity impact per euro revenue. This metric provides investors with an indication of the biodiversity impact intensity of a company. Furthermore, a third metric can be provided, expressing the results in square meter per invested euro. The total combined biodiversity loss of the companies is 1,500 million square kilometers, which is slightly smaller than the land area of Russia. The result is 1,500 million square kilometers where all biodiversity is lost for 1 year. The main driver of biodiversity loss is impact for global warming, which caused a biodiversity loss of 600 million hectares and accounts for 41% of the total impact. The second main driver of biodiversity loss is land use, and it is 34% of the total impact. So, what did we learn? We learned that it is possible to quantify the biodiversity impact of large indices for listed equity. This can inform investments in what sectors and companies have relatively low and high impact on biodiversity and why. And what does this mean from an investment point of view, taking in account the biodiversity targets of the financial institution? And it can guide engagement with companies. What are the key topics to be addressed from a biodiversity point of view when looking at these sectors and companies? And it can also become a benchmark based on modeling with average background data. If that is the case, if it becomes a benchmark, and you as a company are taking steps on biodiversity, but you don't disclose specific data, such as the location of sourcing in your upstream and downstream supply chain, you will be footprinted by the model. Because the average data of the Action database are used, your biodiversity-related actions will not be reflected in the footprint. When companies supply specific data is available, the background data in the Bffi can be replaced by specific information. And so I want to share with you the possibility that these kind of tools and benchmarks in the financial can become a driver for the disclosure of actual data by companies. So to close off, I think it is very important that companies start to disclose the data that is needed. I also would like to encourage all companies and financial institutions to internationally collaborate on getting common ground and share knowledge on the metrics that are needed for these kind of exercises. Thank you.
So this is yet another example of a government that's looking into biodiversity measurement, and in this case, one methodology that's focused on the financial sector. Stephen from Total earlier mentioned another one that's focused on company direct impacts on the ground, the biodiversity indicators for site-based impact methodology. I guess the message is that there are already methodologies out there, people are already trying, so there's no really excuse for companies not to try. And in parallel, we are in a process of trying to standardize and to move in the same direction. So bringing together people developing the methodologies, the Align project mentioned by Elise. So this is happening basically. That's the final message. It's a matter of deciding to be ahead of the curve or lagging behind. Thank you very much, and that's the end of our session.